Greetings, students of History 3780, the Holocaust. This is your professor, Dr. Eli Rubin, and I am coming to you semi-live from the Sachsenhausen Concentration Camp, just north of Berlin, Germany. I'm going to just say a few words about the camp, and then I'm going to take you inside and show you a few different things that I think you might find interesting. After all, this is a way to get a little bit closer to some of the stuff that we've been studying and some of the stuff that you've been learning about in your lectures. So the Sachsenhausen Concentration Camp was not a death camp, it was a concentration camp, but it was specifically designed to hold all kinds of prisoners, people who were political prisoners, people who were Jews, people who were Russian prisoners of war, and even British and Dutch and other nationalities were brought here. Like most concentration camps, they were brought here to work and to eventually be extracted of all the labor that they could provide, given not nearly enough calories to survive on, and when they were no longer able to work, they were disposed of. About 30,000 people were killed here at this camp, and there was about 30,000 people here at the camp at any given time, but people were constantly dying or being killed and then replaced with new inmates. By the time that this camp was liberated by the Soviet Army in 1945, there was only about a little more than 3,000 people left alive. Let's go inside. First thing that you'll notice as we go into the gate, the main entrance through which all the prisoners walked, is a gate with a saying in German, Arbeit macht frei, which means work makes you free. This was placed in iron at the gates of all the concentration camps, including Auschwitz, and it doesn't really mean anything in particular, but it was supposed to give prisoners the idea that they were here to work, and that the harder they worked and the better they worked, the more chance they might have of getting out. Eventually it dawned on most of them, if they didn't already realize it, once they got in, that they were never going to leave, not alive at any rate. And you can see why. It was impossible to escape. Here is the wall, and then there's three layers of barbed wire. So there's sometimes it's called concertina. So these spools of barbed wire, the original ones, you can see they're still very rusted from almost 80 years sitting out here. But you can also see these white porcelain holders that delivered an electric current to them or held them as they were electrified from other sources over there. So it was a lot of voltage, enough to kill anybody who touched these wires. And now if you look, I'm going to show you the whole scope of the camp. And it's laid out in almost like a sun ray fashion, with barracks arching out or angling out from the entrance, so that from the central tower, the guards could see all the barracks easily. We call this the panopticon. As you can see in the distance, guard towers manned day and night with several sharpshooter SS soldiers. Most of the barracks are gone. They were destroyed. And one interesting fact about this camp, and this is also true of other concentration camps, is that after the war, the Soviets took over and arrested a lot of the Nazis that they could find, including a lot of the camp guards and commandants in this camp and other camps and other kinds of Nazis and people who helped the Nazis. They needed a place to put them, and so they put them right back into this concentration camp, only now as prisoners rather than guards. Eventually they were let out. Most of them did some time in prison, some were executed, others were simply basically given a pass because they had been incarcerated long enough, and so then they were let out, and then by that time, the late 1950s, now this place was communist East Germany, and they decided it was time to move on from the war, so they tore down most of the barracks and they turned it into a memorial site. You can still see a couple of the barracks standing over there, but you can't really go in them, or there's nothing to see inside. They're just kind of like a museum. So what I'm going to do is take you to the other side of the camp where the prisoners were executed when they no longer could work, or when it was discovered that they were part of sometimes Allied military intelligence, or they simply had a disease, or sometimes simply there was a large shipment of new prisoners coming and they didn't have enough room in the barracks. You can still see a couple of barracks there, and so they had to make room for the new prisoners, and so they would take them to execute them. Again, about 30,000 people died here between 1940 and 1945. So as I was mentioning, concentration camps, even if they weren't technically death camps, you still needed an ability to dispose of tens of thousands of people over time. People who were no longer fit to work, people who were political prisoners considered too dangerous, including intelligence officers captured from the British Army, from the Russian Army, resistance fighters from occupied territories like in the Netherlands and France and Yugoslavia, and people who were sick, and simply people who were in the way and taking up space for fresh prisoners. Initially behind me in this area here, they had an enclosed area with a chamber with a wall and a small slit in the wall, just wide enough to put a gun barrel through. And they would bring prisoners in one by one and tell them that they were being brought in to be measured, their height, and lined up with their back against the wall. And then the slit, which was vertical, so it aligned with a tall or a short person, and then instead they were shot through the base of the skull. But that was very inefficient and took way too long to kill people one at a time like that. So instead, as you'll see behind me, as we'll go down and check out, they dug an execution trench. And here the SS killed about 20,000 people through firing squads, and they did so over 5 years, from about 40 to 45. So let's go take a look at that. We go down inside this trench. We're about 10, 12 feet below ground, and you'll see these logs. And these were put here by the SS, in part to hold up the dirt from caving in, but also because these logs absorb bullets well. And the prisoners would stand right here. And as you can see, the logs are placed this way. This is a common thing to use to form the backdrop of a shooting range, but also an execution wall, because they absorb the bullets so well. And of course, the SS would stand over in this place here, kind of where this memorial stone is, and they would fire. And you can see that certain nations, such as the country of Luxembourg, have placed memorial plaques here, including a day when 19 citizens of the country of Luxembourg were executed here on the 13th of December. Here, 33 Polish resistance fighters were executed. But these are just special plaques put together by committees of people who wanted to memorialize specific people. There were a lot more than this. And of course here, about 60 officers from the Soviet Red Army, it says, were killed on February 2nd, 1945. And here, about 100 Dutch resistance fighters were executed as well. But you might be asking, of course, what they did with the bodies of 20 or 30,000 people. Well, we're going to go take a look at that next. We're now standing just a little ways away from that trench. And if I pan over here, you can see these buildings here. They look like some kind of industrial buildings, and indeed they are. They were workshops and factories, and this is where many of the prisoners went to work. One of the things that they made were parts for the Heinkel fighter bomber that the German Luftwaffe, or Air Force, used to fight in the war. They also did more inhumane things to the prisoners. One of these other buildings, I believe that one, but I'm not 100% sure, was used to make experimental footwear. The German army and the SS was always looking to gain an advantage in equipment and techniques and other things over their enemies, over the Americans, the Russians, the British. And so they wanted to see if they could make better boots, basically, for the SS than the Americans had. Boots that would hold up better over time, that would help the SS run faster, and so on. And so they would try out different materials, different designs, and they made concentration camp prisoners run, sometimes 25 miles a day, even giving them methamphetamine or cocaine to keep them going. And of course, all this did was exhaust the prisoners more quickly until they dropped dead of exhaustion. And you can see the remains here, with weeds growing out of it, of what was one of the workshops connected to the shoe experimental place. There are also some pieces of evidence that haven't been fully corroborated that in one of these buildings they were experimenting with poison gas. But for those people who died through sickness, but mostly through execution, they were burned in a crematoria, which is no longer here, which is in this grassy area. And you would ask then, what happened to all their ashes? Archaeologists several years ago started doing some digging around here and looking and analyzing the soil. They found this dirt, especially once you dig down a little further, is full of human remains. Ashes of 30,000 people. Less so on the surface, obviously, because of the wind and the erosion. If you dig down a few feet, it's humans. It's all humans. You wouldn't know it, obviously, without doing the soil samples. This grass metabolizes the people who lived and died here. And these stones are memorials for those people. And you might ask, why are these rocks here? You might know the answer to this, but most people don't. In the Jewish tradition, when you pay respects to somebody who's died, either at their gravestone or a memorial for them or a plaque or a statue or something like that, you put a stone on their grave. That comes from the very early days, the ancient days of the Bible, when the Jews in the book of Exodus were in the desert, and when they had to bury somebody who died, you can't really bury people in the sand because the sand shifts because of the desert winds. If you need to bury somebody in the desert, you have to pile rocks on top of them. Otherwise, their body will be exposed the next time there's a sandstorm. So in the Jewish tradition, we put rocks on people's graves or memorials. And so in honor of our class, I picked out this rock, and it never has to be anything special. It can just be any old rock you find up on the ground, because of course that's how the Jews in the ancient desert times did it too. And we'll just put this rock right here to commemorate the 30,000 people whose ashes have been mixed in with the ground here.